As I say, ministers are allegedly drawing up plans for the UK's first grammar schools in almost a quarter of a century. The new Education Secretary, Kit Malthouse, says the Prime Minister wants her government to address the strong desire in quite a lot of parents for more choice. There are more than 150 grammar schools in the UK, but the opening of new ones has been outlawed since 1998. Thanks, Blair. With many arguing that they serve the wealthy, not the poor. So are grammar schools coming to a town near you? Well, to discuss this with me is Peter Hitchens from the Mail on Sunday and Steve Chalke, Chief of the Oasis Academy Trust. Steve, before I come to you, I just want to start with you, Peter. We hear this time and again, don't we, about a Tory politician trying to give some red meat to the grassroots by saying they'll bring back grammar schools, but it never ultimately happens. Why is that?
Well, because they don't mean it. The Conservative Party took a major part in destroying the grammar schools because it turned out to be politically easier to destroy them than to save them, or indeed to build the necessary new ones required in the 1950s when the population increased as much as it did. The Tory Party has in recent years developed a sort of tendency to start talking about grammar schools whenever it becomes unpopular because it knows there's a constituency for them. But the huge task of actually reintroducing a properly academically selective national secondary school system is one they're not prepared to risk. They fear it might make them unpopular, and they also fear that they couldn't actually manage to do it. So it is just air. It's a great pity that it's just air, and I wish it were otherwise. But I've just spent a couple of years writing a book on the subject, on the history of how the grammar schools were destroyed, and it's perfectly obvious that the Conservative Party is not the ally of good state education in this country and only pretends to be when it suits it.
Steve, on that point, if you consider all of the prime ministers that we had in this country who went to grammar schools, you had the Margaret Thatcher line where she said, actually, I needed my grammar school to compete with those from privileged homes like Shirley Williams and Anthony Wedgwood Benn. She was right, wasn't she?
Well, it was her that shut most of them, which is strange, isn't it? Margaret Thatcher is the Secretary of State for Education who shut more grammar schools than anyone else, more grammar schools than the Labour Party. Now, I disagree with Peter. I think they're entirely, I think they're entirely unhelpful. I think they cause all sorts of problems for everybody in the system. And what I'd really like to see us as moving forward rather than moving backward to a failed idea. The reason Margaret Thatcher shut them, of course, is that they prove divisive in every community. People vote for grammar schools and then they find out at the age of 11 that their child can't get in. Not because they're not intelligent, but the 11 plus system isn't measuring the kind of intelligence, the broad sweep of intelligences that they have. I failed the 11 plus, so I know what it's like to sit on the end of that failure, but not for myself. It's simply that I think it's too narrow assessment at too early in life to either write people off or give them access. And of course, what happens in areas where grammar schools do exist, we run 52 academies and work in areas where grammar schools do exist. What happens in those areas is kids that pass at the age of 11 are creamed off. That doesn't help with the levelling up for every child. And actually, it doesn't help them in their education. We even have people in the areas where we work who pass the 11 plus, get into grammar school education, and then parents bring them back into a more comprehensive education because they feel that that's a better social and emotional and psychological all-round development for them.
Because, Peter, coming back to you, I mean, the grammar schools that we do have that remain in this country are immensely popular. You've got parents trying to game the system by buying houses in catchment areas with a good grammar school. There's still a clamber for these things. Why do you think that the process of selection on that 11 plus is so intensely popular and that these schools ultimately remain some of the best in the country?
Well, the remaining grammar schools are not really much of a help to my argument because, like the elite comprehensive schools, which also exist, they are besieged by parents who, in the case of the elite comprehensive schools, they buy expensive houses in expensive catchment areas, so effectively buying a better state education for their children. The same with grammar schools. They are, in many cases, particularly in Kent and Buckinghamshire, within range of London commuting. And so they're also besieged by parents. I think the price of a private education these days is something approaching £200,000 post-tax income. Anybody who can possibly avoid doing that will do it. So those grammar schools are besieged. What you need is a national system where the thing actually operates on the basis of merit, as it should. There's no need, by the way, for grammar schools to select through the 11 plus, or even to select at the age of 11. Scotland, when it had equivalent schools, selected, I think, at 13, and Germany doesn't use, which continues very successfully to have grammar schools, doesn't use the 11 plus. It uses a system of assessment. So you've got to not mix up the schools with the various historic methods which we use to select for them. But the basic problem with grammar schools in this country was that there were never enough of them. And that they were very unevenly spread. And Wales had a very good provision, for instance, but many other parts of the country had very few. And nothing was done to put this right by the Conservative or Labour governments between 1945 and 1965, when they shut them down. But they were extremely good schools, and the education system in this country was far, far better at that time than it is now. At the time the grammar schools existed, when incidentally they were outdoing the private schools for Oxbridge entrance. At the time the grammar schools existed, it was generally said that a set of English A-levels were worth the same as an American university degree. Well, no one would say that now because it's not true. But since the grammar schools were destroyed, the whole level of education in this country for everybody, including in the private schools, has been drastically reduced. And they kept the education system honest. I'd love to bring them back, but I think one of the problems about destroying them is that it destroyed the educated level in this country of people who were intelligent and educated enough to realise that they were worth having. So trying to get them past our dim-witted political class, and indeed our education establishment now, is probably impossible. That's the conclusion I've come to in my book. Anyway, it's a great shame.
Okay. We look forward to the book, Peter.
Huge benefit to the country if we did restore them, but I'm afraid they've had it.
Steve, just really briefly, if you would, do you think this governmental review could actually shine a light on how, as Peter mentions, there are other models around the world that we could perhaps emulate to make grammar schools fairer?
Yeah, there are two things I agree with Peter about and one thing I disagree with him very strongly about. The two things I agree with him about absolutely is this government isn't going to bring back grammar schools. They're only going to run for another couple of years as a government, aren't they, at the most? And it's just impossible to achieve in that time. Secondly, I agree with Peter that Peter was suggesting that other countries that do have a grammar school system don't rely on something as draconian and as narrow as the 11 plus. So we need to rethink our method of assessment altogether. And I think that's what Peter was suggesting. I'm completely up for that because we only measure a certain type of intelligence, and that's what's crippling us because we miss all the creativity that's there in other ways. The thing I disagree about is, the kids at the moment that end up in grammar schools are there because they're middle class, because their parents can afford to buy a property near a grammar school, and because they can send them off for loads of extra tuition in the evening. So this is nothing about creating equality. It's all about separating.
I agree with that.
And I strongly disapprove.
That's the point about small pockets of surviving grammar schools. That's what will happen to them. Unless you have an evenly spread system of academic selection, you'll have an evenly spread system of selection by wealth, which is what we have now. If you had to choose between selection by wealth and selection by ability, what would the rational person do? Ability, obviously, but everybody now shouts for selection by wealth. Or rather,
we'll have to leave it there.
Can't imagine why that is.
Thank you very much for your thoughts, and we look forward to the book. That's Peter Hitchens from the Mail on Sunday, and Steve Chalke there, the chief of the Oasis Academy Trust, giving his opinion there.